I want you to remember this feeling, the exact moment when everything you built, everything you believed in, gets ripped away from you by the people you trusted most, because that's the moment that defines what comes next. And for me, Riley Foster, 35 years old, standing in that glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the Morrison Tech Building in downtown Seattle, watching my boss's mouth move but barely hearing the words, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, when the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like static against the windows. I had given Morrison Tech 6 years of my life, 6 years of late nights and missed birthdays and relationships that withered because I was always checking my phone, always thinking about the next product launch, the next client pitch, the next impossible deadline that somehow I always met. I was the director of product development, the person who turned Marcus Morrison's half-baked ideas into actual functioning software that companies paid serious money for. I was the one who built the team from 3 people to 27, who created the workflow systems that made us efficient, who knew every line of code in our flagship product like it was written on my own skin. Marcus sat across from me that morning, his hands folded on the table, his expensive watch catching the gray light from the window. And next to him was Jennifer Cho, our new chief operating officer who had been hired 8 months ago from some Silicon Valley startup. She had one of those faces that always looked like it was suppressing a smile, like she knew something you didn't, and I guess she did. Marcus cleared his throat and said, "Riley, we need to talk about restructuring." And I remember thinking that was such a corporate word, restructuring, like they were talking about rearranging furniture instead of dismantling someone's entire career. He said the company was moving in a new direction, that they needed someone with a different skill set to lead product development, someone with more experience in enterprise solutions, and I just stared at him because I had been developing enterprise solutions for 6 years. I had landed our 3 biggest clients personally. I had spoken at conferences about our methodologies, and now he was sitting there telling me my skill set wasn't right. Jennifer jumped in with that rehearsed, sympathetic tone that consultants use. She said they valued everything I had contributed, but the role was evolving beyond my expertise. She actually used those words, beyond my expertise, and I felt something crack inside my chest. They offered me a severance package, 3 months' salary, and a glowing reference letter. They said I could take the rest of the day to clear out my desk. Marcus wouldn't even look me in the eye when he said it. This man who had called me at 2 a.m. 3 years ago when the servers crashed before our biggest product demo, who had told me I was the smartest person he'd ever worked with, who had promised me equity once we hit our next funding round, he just sat there examining his cuticles while Jennifer slid the termination papers across the table. I didn't cry, not then. I signed the papers with a hand that somehow stayed steady. I shook their hands, because that's what you do when you're still pretending you have dignity left. And I walked out of that conference room past the team I had built, past Sarah, who I had personally mentored from junior developer to team lead, past Marcus's assistant who wouldn't meet my eyes, past the motivational posters about innovation and disruption that suddenly seemed like jokes. I packed my desk in 17 minutes, personal photos, my favorite coffee mug that said, "Keep calm and debug on," the small succulent plant my mom had given me that had somehow survived my neglect, and then I was standing on the street in the rain without an umbrella, holding a cardboard box, and wondering how 6 years could fit into something so small. The betrayal didn't hit me all at once. It came in waves over the following days. First, there was the practical panic. The spreadsheets I made at 3 a.m. calculating how long my savings would last. The job applications I filled out with hands that shook from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The humiliation of explaining to my mother over the phone that, yes, I had been let go. No, it wasn't my fault. Yes, I would be fine, even though I didn't believe it. Then there was the deeper pain, the kind that made it hard to breathe, when I realized that Marcus had been planning this for months. I found out through Tyler, one of the developers who still talked to me. He called me 2 weeks after I was terminated and told me they had been interviewing my replacement for 3 months before they fired me. 3 months of me training my team, of me staying until 9 at night to finish projects. of me believing I was essential, and the whole time Marcus and Jennifer had been parading candidates through the office on days when I was working from home or meeting with clients. They had hired someone named Derek Chen, some hotshot from Google with an MBA from Stanford, and he started exactly 1 week after I left. I spent a month in what I can only describe as a fog. I would wake up at the time I used to leave for work and then remember I had nowhere to go. I scrolled through LinkedIn watching my former colleagues post about exciting new projects, about team lunches, about the innovation happening at Morrison Tech, and I wasn't part of any of it. I went to 3 job interviews where the hiring managers seemed impressed until they called Morrison Tech for a reference, and then suddenly the position was filled, or they went with an internal candidate. I realized Marcus wasn't giving me the glowing reference he had promised. He was giving me something lukewarm at best, something that made people hesitate. The anger came later, around week 6. I was sitting in a coffee shop on Capitol Hill, the one with the exposed brick walls and the baristas with arm tattoos, and I overheard 2 guys at the next table talking about project management software. One of them said he was looking for something better than what they currently used, something more intuitive, and I realized I knew exactly what he needed because I had built it. I had spent 3 years developing the exact solution to his problem, and Morrison Tech was probably charging him $15,000 a year for it. That's when something shifted inside me. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started feeling something else, something harder and sharper. I thought about all the ideas I had brought to Marcus that he had rejected, all the features I had wanted to develop that he said were too risky or too expensive, or not what clients were asking for. I thought about the list I kept in a notebook. 12 pages of product improvements and new tools that I knew the market needed but Marcus was too cautious to pursue. And I realized something that made my pulse quicken in a way it hadn't in weeks. I knew everything about Morrison Tech's weaknesses. I knew their code base. I knew their client complaints. I knew exactly what their software couldn't do, and I knew how to do it better. I went home that afternoon and I didn't job hunt. I didn't update my resume. I opened my laptop and I started writing code. I worked for 16 hours straight, barely stopping to eat, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that came from pure furious energy. I built the foundation for something I had been dreaming about for 2 years. A project management tool that actually understood how creative teams worked, that had the flexibility Morrison Tech's product lacked, that solved the problems I heard clients complain about over and over. I called it Axis, and for the next 3 months, I disappeared into it. I used my severance money to hire freelance developers I knew from previous jobs, people who were talented but had been overlooked by the big companies. I found a designer in Portland who created an interface so clean and intuitive, it made Morrison Tech's software look clunky by comparison. I worked 18-hour days. I lost 12 pounds. I stopped returning my mother's calls because I didn't want to explain what I was doing. Didn't want to hear the concern in her voice or answer questions about whether this was healthy. The technical work was the easy part. I was good at that. I had always been good at that. The hard part was the business side. I needed funding. I needed clients. I needed to build something fast enough that Morrison Tech wouldn't see me coming. I pitched to 7 investors and got rejected by all of them. They said the market was saturated. They said I didn't have enough business experience. They said competing with an established player like Morrison Tech was suicide for a solo founder. The 8th investor was a woman named Patricia Okafor, who ran a small venture capital firm in San Francisco. She had started 3 companies herself and sold 2 of them, and when I showed her Axis, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is what Morrison should have built 3 years ago." Patricia gave me $250,000 and introduced me to her network. Suddenly I had meetings with CTOs and product managers at companies that needed better tools. I had a lawyer helping me incorporate. I had an accountant setting up the business structure, and I had something else, something that kept me going through the 20-hour days and the stress that made my jaw ache from clenching. I had purpose. I had a goal that wasn't just about building a successful company. It was about proving that Marcus Morrison had made the biggest mistake of his professional life. 6 months after I was fired, I launched Axis with 3 clients who had agreed to be early adopters, small design agencies in Seattle and Portland who were tired of Morrison Tech's inflexibility. The feedback was exactly what I had hoped for. They loved the interface, they loved the customization options, they loved that our pricing was 30% lower than Morrison's, and most importantly, they loved that when they had a problem or a feature request, they talked directly to me, to someone who understood their needs, because I had been in the industry for a decade, not to some customer service representative reading from a script. Word spread the way it does in tight-knit professional communities. One creative director told another. One project manager mentioned us in a Slack channel. One agency posted about us on Twitter. And within 8 weeks, I had 23 clients, most of them companies that had previously used Morrison Tech or were considering it. I hired 4 employees, including Tyler, who quit Morrison Tech to join me. He told me things had gotten weird there after Derek Chen took over, that projects were running behind schedule, that clients were complaining, that the culture I had built was falling apart under new management. I didn't let myself feel satisfied yet. I was still too small, too vulnerable. Morrison Tech could have crushed me with their marketing budget and their established reputation, if they had noticed me, but they didn't. Not at first. They were too busy with whatever Derek Chen was doing, probably reimagining everything I had built in a way that looked good on a whiteboard, but didn't work in practice. I kept my head down and focused on making Axis better every single day, on responding to client feedback within hours, on building the kind of company I had always wanted Morrison Tech to be. The first time Marcus noticed me was at the Pacific Northwest Tech Summit in November. 9 months after he had fired me, I was there representing Axis. I had a small booth in the startup section. Nothing fancy, just a banner and some promotional materials and a laptop running demos. Marcus walked past with Jennifer and Derek. They were heading to the main stage where Morrison Tech was a platinum sponsor, and I watched Marcus's face when he saw me. Watched the confusion become recognition, become something harder to read. He stopped, his entourage stopping with him, and he said, "Riley, what are you doing here?" I smiled, a real smile, not the professional mask I used to wear, and I said, "I'm showcasing my company, Axis. We do project management software for creative teams. Maybe you've heard of us." I saw Jennifer's expression change, saw her whisper something to Derek, who pulled out his phone and started typing. Marcus said something about how great it was that I had landed on my feet, how he always knew I was talented, and I just kept smiling because we both knew he was lying. He asked me some questions about Axis that sounded casual but were clearly reconnaissance, who my clients were, what my pricing model was, how I was funded, and I gave him answers that were true but vague. Protecting information the way you protect wounds. The real moment came 3 months later, in February, 1 year almost to the day after Marcus had fired me. I got a call from Sandra Vega, the CTO of Cascade Creative, Morrison Tech's biggest client, the company that accounted for almost 30% of their revenue. Sandra said she had heard about Axis from a friend, that she was frustrated with Morrison Tech's lack of responsiveness and their recent price increase, that she wanted to see a demo. I met with her the next week in her office overlooking Elliott Bay, the water gray and choppy under a sky that threatened snow, and I showed her what Axis could do. Sandra didn't make decisions lightly. She asked hard questions. She tested edge cases. She wanted to see our security documentation and our uptime statistics and our roadmap for the next year, but I had answers for everything, because I had been preparing for this moment since the day I started building Axis. At the end of our second meeting, she said she wanted to migrate Cascade Creative's entire operation to our platform. 280 users, a contract worth $400,000 annually, more money than Axis had made in total so far, and more importantly, a client that Morrison Tech absolutely could not afford to lose. I told Sandra we could handle it, that we would make the transition seamless, that she wouldn't regret this, and after she signed the contract, I sat in my car in the parking garage and I let myself feel it. The pure, crystalline satisfaction of knowing that Marcus was about to find out what I had done. I drove back to my office, a small space in Pioneer Square that was nothing like Morrison Tech's polished headquarters, but felt more like home than that place ever had. And I told my team we had just landed the biggest deal in our company's history. Tyler hugged me, actually lifted me off the ground, and I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. Marcus called me 2 days later, his voice tight with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. He said, "Riley, we need to talk." He asked if we could meet for coffee, somewhere neutral. I suggested the same place where I had overheard those guys talking about project management software all those months ago, the conversation that had sparked everything. Marcus looked older when he walked in. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, or maybe I just hadn't noticed them. He ordered a black coffee and sat down across from me and said, "You poached my client." I let the words sit between us for a moment before I responded. I said, "Sandra came to me. I didn't reach out to her. She was unhappy with your service and your pricing, and she wanted an alternative. I gave her one. That's not poaching. That's business." Marcus leaned forward, and his voice dropped low. He said, "You know exactly what you're doing. You built a competing product using everything you learned while working for me, using connections you made on my payroll. This is corporate espionage, Riley." And I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept my face neutral. I said, "Everything I built on my own time with my own money after you terminated me. I didn't steal your code. I didn't steal your clients. I didn't break any non-compete agreement because you never made me sign one. You fired me, Marcus. You told me my skills weren't good enough, so I used those skills to build something better. And now you're upset because I succeeded." He stared at me, and I could see him trying to find an angle, trying to figure out if there was anything illegal about what I had done. But we both knew there wasn't. I had been careful. I had checked with lawyers. I had made sure every step was defensible. Marcus changed tactics. He said, "This doesn't have to be adversarial. What if we work together? What if Morrison Tech acquired Axis?" He threw out a number. It was more money than I had ever imagined having. Enough to retire comfortably, enough to make all the stress and sleepless nights seem worth it. But I didn't even hesitate. I said no. He looked genuinely surprised. He said, "Riley, be reasonable. You're a startup competing against an established company. You got lucky with one big client, but that doesn't mean you can sustain this. Take the offer. It's generous." And I shook my head. I said, "You want to know why I'm saying no, Marcus? It's because you didn't just fire me. You did it in the cruelest way possible. You made me believe I was valued right up until the moment you replaced me. You made me train my own team while you were interviewing my replacement behind my back. You lied about giving me a good reference, and now you want me to just hand you the company I built from nothing, because you're scared of the competition. So no, I'm not selling to you. I'm going to take every client you have that's unhappy. I'm going to build a better product, and I'm going to make you regret ever underestimating me." Marcus's face went red. He stood up fast enough that his chair scraped against the floor. He said, "You'll regret this, Riley. You have no idea what you're up against." And then he walked out, leaving his untouched coffee on the table. I sat there for a long time afterward, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, wondering if I had just made a terrible mistake, wondering if pride was worth more than financial security. But deep down I knew the answer. Some things matter more than money. Some things you can't put a price on. The next 6 months were brutal. Morrison Tech went on the offensive. They slashed their prices trying to undercut us. They launched a marketing campaign highlighting their stability and experience. They spread rumors through industry channels that Axis was unstable, that we didn't have adequate security, that we would probably go bankrupt within a year. It worked on some potential clients who decided to stick with the established player. But it backfired on others who saw Morrison Tech's desperation and wondered what they were so scared of. We lost 2 clients to Morrison Tech's pressure campaign, small agencies that couldn't risk betting on a startup. But we gained 5 more, including 2 of Morrison Tech's mid-size clients who were tired of being taken for granted. Derek Chen made a catastrophic mistake in May when he pushed out a major update that broke several key features. Their clients were locked out of their accounts for 6 hours. And by the time Morrison Tech got everything working again, the damage was done. 3 more companies called me asking about migration timelines. Patricia introduced me to a larger investor group in July. I pitched access to a room full of venture capitalists in a conference room that overlooked downtown San Francisco, and I told them what I was building wasn't just a product, it was a different way of thinking about business software. Something built by people who actually used the tools they were creating. Something that valued user experience over feature bloat. Something that put clients first instead of treating them like revenue streams. They funded us with $2.3 million, and suddenly I had the resources to scale. I hired 12 more people. I opened a proper office. I invested in marketing and sales. And most importantly, I kept improving the product. Every feature Morrison Tech announced, we built better. Every client complaint about their software, we solved in ours. By October, 18 months after Marcus had fired me, Axis had 74 clients and revenue of $1.8 million. Morrison Tech had lost 11 clients to us directly, and their growth had stalled. I knew this because Tyler still had friends there who told him things, who said morale was terrible, who said Derek Chen was overwhelmed, who said Marcus spent most of his time in closed-door meetings with Jennifer trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. The industry noticed. TechCrunch wrote an article about Axis as a rising star in the project management space. They interviewed me, and I talked about building software that actually solved problems instead of creating new ones, about the importance of listening to users, about how sometimes the best companies come from people who were told they weren't good enough. The article mentioned that I had previously worked at Morrison Tech, that I had left to start Axis. It didn't mention that I was fired, but anyone who knew the industry could read between the lines. Marcus tried to reach out again in November. Not directly, but through Jennifer. She called me and used that same sympathetic tone she had used when they fired me. She said they wanted to discuss a partnership. That maybe there was a way both companies could benefit from working together. I told her I wasn't interested in partnering with people who had treated me the way they did. She said I was being emotional instead of practical, that I was letting personal feelings get in the way of good business sense, and I actually laughed, and told her that sometimes personal feelings are exactly what should drive business decisions, that loyalty and integrity matter more than profit margins, and then I hung up. The final piece fell into place in January, 2 years after I had been fired. Cascade Creative was so happy with Axis that Sandra Vega started recommending us to other CTOs in her network. One of those connections was David Torres, the head of technology at Meridian Corp., a massive advertising conglomerate with offices in 8 cities. Meridian was Morrison Tech's second-largest client, worth almost $500,000 a year. David called me because Sandra had told him Axis was everything Morrison Tech's platform should have been. I flew to New York to meet with David and his team. I spent 3 days in presentations and technical demos and contract negotiations, and at the end of it, they signed a 5-year agreement worth $3.2 million. It was more money than I had ever imagined, more validation than I had dared to hope for, and I knew exactly what it would do to Morrison Tech. They couldn't survive losing both their top clients in 2 years, not with their overhead, not with their declining reputation. I was back in Seattle when I got the email from Tyler. He had finally quit Morrison Tech the week before. Sick of watching the company fall apart, and he sent me a short message that said, "You should know. Marcus announced layoffs today. They're cutting 40% of staff. Jennifer is being let go. Rumor is they're looking for a buyer." I stared at my screen reading those words over and over, and I felt something complicated wash over me. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret, something in between. I thought about Sarah, the developer I had mentored, who probably just lost her job. I thought about the other team members I had trained and worked with, people who had nothing to do with Marcus's decision to fire me but who were suffering the consequences anyway. I felt guilty for about 10 minutes, and then I remembered standing in that conference room 2 years ago, remembered the humiliation, remembered being told my skills weren't good enough, remembered the 3 months they spent interviewing my replacement while I worked myself to exhaustion for them, and the guilt faded. The business press picked up the story in February, articles about Morrison Tech's decline, about how they had lost market position to an upstart competitor founded by a former employee. One journalist called me for comment, and I kept it professional. I said competition was good for the industry, that it pushed everyone to build better products, that I had tremendous respect for what Morrison Tech had accomplished even as Axis was charting its own path. But inside I was screaming. Inside I wanted to say they did this to themselves. They threw away their best asset, and now they're paying the price. Marcus sold Morrison Tech in March. A private equity firm bought them for a fraction of what the company would have been worth 2 years earlier. Marcus stayed on as an advisor, but he was no longer in charge. He had lost his company the same way I had lost my job, suddenly and completely, and I wondered if he lay awake at night thinking about the moment he decided to fire me, wondering if he regretted it, wondering if things could have been different. I saw him one last time at the Pacific Northwest Tech Summit in May. 3 years after he had fired me, Axis was a platinum sponsor now. We had the kind of booth Morrison Tech used to have. Polished and professional with a team of people manning it, Marcus walked by and our eyes met across the crowded exhibition hall. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, and for a second I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He nodded at me. A tiny acknowledgement, and kept walking, and I let him go because I had nothing left to say to him. Axis crossed $10 million in annual revenue that summer. We had offices in 3 cities. We had 147 employees. We had 263 clients, including 7 of Morrison Tech's former top accounts. Patricia told me we should think about going public in a few years, about building toward an IPO or a major acquisition, and I realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about proving Marcus wrong and started being about building something that mattered, something that would outlast both of us. But late at night when I couldn't sleep, when I was alone in my apartment looking out at the Seattle skyline, I still thought about that Tuesday morning in March when Marcus Morrison told me I wasn't good enough. I thought about the cardboard box and the rain and the feeling of everything solid turning to sand beneath my feet. And I thought about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that sets you free. How sometimes betrayal is just the universe forcing you to bet on yourself. I built something better than Morrison Tech ever was. I built it from anger and humiliation, and a desperate need to prove I was worth more than they saw in me. And in the end, I didn't just beat Marcus Morrison. I made him irrelevant. I made him a footnote in my success. And that was the thing he could never take away from me. The knowledge that when they tried to destroy me, I used the rubble to build a foundation. And on that foundation, I created something they never could, something real and lasting and mine. Because they taught me the most important lesson anyone can learn in this industry. The only person you can truly count on is yourself. And if you're going to succeed, it has to be on your own terms, playing by your own rules, building something so undeniably good that the people who dismissed you have no choice but to watch from the sidelines while you rise.